history has shown us this before, because if you look to Nazi Germany, it came out of a massive cost of living issue.
The Civil War. Cromwell, the Civil War.
Oh, not that Civil War, no.
The DoD has put a lot of money in expanding certain Australian air bases and ports and stuff to accommodate like U.S. long-range strategic bombers and stuff.
Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Espresso Martini. Matt, how are you?
I'm good, Chris. I'm about to start hurling cruise missiles at the squirrels in my garden, but other than that, we're good. Yeah.
So you got a big campaign lined up for the week.
The cheeky bastards keep digging around my flowers, and if they keep at it, I'm gonna respond at a time and place of my choosing.
Fair enough. Well, they can be quite dangerous because they can eat your electrical cables and things, can't they?
Oh yeah, I guess I haven't had any issues with that, but I don't know. It's crazy. You can't even finish your coffee in the morning. You got people violating your territorial sovereignty.
How dare they? Oh dear. Actually, once had a friend who had a squirrel problem where they lived, and they ended up having to take anti-anxiety medication because the sound was driving them up the wall. So it's like
Squirrels.
Yeah, the squirrels. They could just hear it on the roof all the time, and it was at weird times of the day, and it just gave them anxiety. So I'm like, okay,
That's like a very Hitchcock kind of thing. I don't know. It's like slowly drive someone nuts, and they're
yeah.
I think that's Poe.
The squirrels coming to a cinema news.
Yeah, rapping at my chamber door.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, I remember seeing the birds for the first time a long time ago, and every time I walk past a flock of birds, I'm a bit cautious. So
yeah, when the teacher got her eyes pecked out, that traumatized me as a kid. I remember watching it, or I remember seeing it and I was little and telling my mom like, "Oh, I want to watch that," and she was like, "It'll scare the crap out of you." I'm like, "No, I want to watch it," and then I did, and spoiler alert, it did scare the crap out of me. So you were right, Mom.
Yeah. Well, no, power of cinema, man. It can leave a lasting impression, especially when you're young.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we've got a jam-packed episode. We're going to be looking at the UK local elections and the rise of Reform UK. We'll be looking at the Australian and Canadian elections, and then we'll be wrapping up looking at the firing or demotion of Tim Waltz. So we will start with the UK local elections and the rise of reform. So I'm going to draw on two articles. We've got one by Andrew Marr for the New Statesman called "Does Farage Own the Future?" And then we've got a piece from The Guardian called "Farage Claims Reform UK Local Election Gains the Beginning of the End for the Tories." And that's by Peter Walker, Alina Courier, and Kieran Stacey. And I hope I got all the names right there. Apologies if I didn't. Nigel Farage's Reform UK has transitioned from a protest group to a major political force, winning a parliamentary by-election and over 600 local council seats. It's a breakthrough in both Labour and Conservative strongholds, and it signals a dramatic shift in voter alignment. The Tories suffered catastrophic losses, losing all 15 councils that they were defending and falling to fourth place in the national vote projections. Internal unrest is growing, with doubts over the party's direction and leadership. While Labour remains the largest opposition force, it faces growing threats. Reform is drawing support from economically disillusioned working-class voters, while Starmer's party is seen out of touch on cost of living issues like winter fuel cuts. Criticism is also mounting over the party's strategic complacency. Farage has embraced Trump-like messaging, attacking diversity, environmental policies, and asylum accommodations, whilst pledging to block such initiatives in reform-run councils. This represents a shift from populist rhetoric to actionable policy threats. With gains by the Liberal Democrats and Greens alongside reforms' surge, the UK is rapidly becoming a multi-party system. This could usher in unstable conditions and increase political volatility unless Labour succeeds successfully projects a confident, future-facing vision of economic revival and social stability before both the next local elections and the next general election. So, Matt, I don't know what your thoughts were on this from stateside. I don't know how that's sort of being covered or not.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things normally we would not cover a local UK election, council elections and such. But I suggested that we take a look at this a bit. Just, I mean, if you're here in the US, I mean, media here, you wouldn't really hear about it, I think, unless you like seek it out. I mean, we have our own stuff going on at the moment, but it's one of those things, and I mean, at least how I see as the American side of it. I mean, there's a different parts of UK politics, like I don't know, like NHS spending or something that I don't really have an opinion on, and I wouldn't weigh in on because it's just frankly not really my business. But I mean, some stuff like, I don't know, Trident or defense spending or international affairs or, Brexit or something. I was no fan of Corbyn and the kind of personalities he elevated when he controlled Labour. I thought if he got to number 10, it would be a catastrophe. So stuff like that. Yeah, I have an opinion and I'll say so. But I wanted to sort of, take a look at this with you to get your sense and explain a bit about what happened here and what's going on. The potential of the UK having a multi-party system is certainly a first, at least in my knowledge of British history, and would shake things up a bit. But I mean, moreover, I see echoes of the very recent past. Voters become exasperated with drama and dysfunction of a sitting conservative government and vote them out in favor of a center-left government promising stability, maturity, and a return to normalcy. That government immediately is slapped in the face with the realities of governing and stumbles a bit. Voters are dissatisfied by it. And then drift toward a far more unpleasant, destructive, faux populist movement. I mean, I've seen this movie before, and it wasn't a good one. That's not to say that, that's what's going to happen here. I mean, the next general election is until, 2029, so there's plenty of time, but...
A lot of things can happen between now and then.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely been a wake-up call for Labour. I at this, in the last general election, I voted towards Labour because I felt that they were the best equipped to deal with things. I wasn't a fan of Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, so I refused to vote for Labour then. So that's just being transparent about where I'm kind of coming from. I think that Labour have suffered a bit from a communications issue because like the winter fuel allowance, which is one of the sticking points for voters at the moment. So from my understanding, with the winter fuel allowance that was brought out by the Conservatives during 2022 and the kind of the fuel crisis and increased fuel costs that were coming because of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, it wasn't means tested. So it kind of meant everybody would blanketly get this money, and there were quite a few people who didn't really need the winter fuel allowance. So in a way, it kind of was wasting money. So the Labour, who are sort of trying to cut costs so they can reinvest those costs in hopefully social services, but also now, again, with increasing kind of national security issues, defence has now become a priority, etc., which again, from a left-wing perspective, is never traditionally popular. With the winter fuel allowance, the way that they just executed this plan where they basically made it means tested. I don't think they communicated it very well, and so it kind of led to headlines where basically people were under the perception that very poor people were going to be robbed their winter fuel allowance, when if they went through the means testing system, they wouldn't. The people who would lose it are the people who likely didn't need it. So, and I learned about it from Rory Stewart on The Rest is Politics. It took a former Conservative MP to explain it on The Rest is Politics for me to kind of fully understand it.
Cats and dogs, etc. Yeah.
And it just shows that there was a messaging problem there. And I
Yeah.
think this is a traditional left-wing issue. Messaging has always been poor. And in fact, when messaging was quite good was probably during Tony Blair's time under Alistair Campbell. He kind of knew how to put things, for both good and bad, in a way that people understood, which I think Labour post post-Blair have become a little bit allergic to sometimes. And obviously, using spin doctors, etc., is sort of seen as a negative. But communication is very important from sort of a political perspective.
You make a good point there. I mean, looking back at this in the analogy of the Biden administration, I mean, arguably, good policies, good outcomes, if not immediate and flashy outcomes, horrible messaging.
Yeah. And they almost refuse to defend or point out
Right.
or explain the positives. Like the economy in the US was in a very strong point until, unfortunately, recently with some things that are kind of going on.
Yeah, at least compared to everybody else coming out of COVID together,
And yet in the US, and speaking both with US friends and then going to the US after the elections, etc., the perception was that everybody was a lot poorer. And so the Democrats didn't want to talk about the successes of the economy because a lot of people felt poorer. But the problem is they let the negative perceptions take over. So, and I can't speak for America, I don't live in America, but I do know there's a cost of living issue that's happening here as well.
Oh, yeah.
And how we fix that is out of my remit. But there is a big problem. And I think I've said this before, that this cost of living crisis is technically a national security one too, because it is allowing, history has shown us this before, because if you look to Nazi Germany, it came out of a massive cost of living issue as a result of reparations from World War I, and that got exploited. And that, when people feel poor and vulnerable, unfortunately, bad decisions get made sometimes. And certainly I've seen, unfortunately, there's been a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric that has been around as long as I can remember in different forms. And it's difficult to say whether it's got worse or better, because since the 90s, or the late 90s, there's always been problems like with the asylum camps in Calais, etc. in the 90s was the big thing that people used to talk about, them coming over from France. And then obviously it's grown because of the war in Syria, etc. And then other Mediterranean countries are now sort of dealing with a huge influx of people. And this has all become sort of weaponized. So where we're at politically today is not too dissimilar from 2013 and 2014. So I was just trying to remember the build up to the 2015 elections. So in 2013, 2014, the local elections, UKIP achieved unexpected success, which obviously signaled a growing kind of public backlash against the political establishment. So in 2013, UKIP won 147 seats across county councils in England, making significant inroads into traditional conservative areas. And then the following year, in 2014, they got 166 council seats. And then they significantly topped the European Parliament elections of 27.5% of the vote. So, these local elections typically are seen as a protest vote. So what tends to happen with local elections is typically a lot of younger people don't bother voting because they don't see it as important. And that's always been a problem with local elections. Then the people who are really committed to voting tend to use it as a protest vote. So
right.
They're really annoyed with whoever's sitting in power. They will vote for the opposite. And if they're not happy with the opposite, they'll vote for the next one along. And this is where I think UKIP benefited, and I think now the Reformer benefiting. And the problem is then it does have a knock-on effect on policies. So there'll be conversations going on right now, both in the Labour Party and Conservative headquarters, about what can we do to appeal to the person who voted for reform. And generally then they end up learning bad lessons. And so especially from a Labour perspective, because I don't think the hardcore of Labour are going to want to adopt more right-wing populist policies regarding anti-immigration, etc. But you might start to see the party might start to adjust its rhetoric on immigration and say we're going to be harder on this, that, and the other. I know Starmer set up a special task force with MI5 to crack people trafficking, because obviously there are the Russian government has used the weaponization of asylum as a bit of a tactic to disrupt European politics. We talked about this in my episode with Philip Abaji when he talked about how the Wagner Group and Russian mercenaries are kind of actually steering certain people towards Europe and things to cause this crisis.
A few years ago, Lukashenko's government in Belarus were essentially,
Yes.
herding migrants from Africa and elsewhere toward the Polish border.
Definitely. So they do see it, unfortunately, is getting weaponized by Russia a little. It doesn't explain everything. Don't get me wrong. Not everybody, not every asylum seeker is here because of Russia, etc. There's a whole range of things. But Russia do very well. They look at a problem and look how to, use existing issue to kind of heighten other problems and destabilize. That's what they do. It's a very effective thing. And that's why I think Starmer up this MI5 thing, because there are these people trafficking networks that have tangential links to the Russian government, etc., or Russian money at least. So that obviously, in a way, looks tough and might appeal to sort of right-wing voters, and it may well have helped him with the election. I don't know. So there's this danger that UKIP can that Reform can start setting the tone for the next election. So I think it's next year's local elections that will be bigger than this year's. Next year's will be much bigger.
Right.
And I suspect you'll probably still see Reform doing well, but I think it will affect the Conservatives more directly than Labour. I think there will still be an indirect problem for Labour because there are definitely traditional working class communities who were seen as traditionally voting Labour who have moved away from Labour. I mean, in the 2019 general election, some of the people who were involved with the 1980s miners' strike, who were very anti-Thatcher, very pro-Labour, became very anti-Labour and ended up voting for the Conservatives. So it just shows some of the journey some voters have been on. And then you get coastal communities that jobs are scarce, and then the problem is with that, then right-wing parties kind of then make it out that, Johnny foreigners coming in to take your jobs, and certainly with the EU situation changing for us positively in the early sort of late 90s, early 2000s, you did get an influx of people from Eastern Europe who started to take over and work cheaper on sort of more manual jobs like being a plumber, decorator, a painter, and suddenly that did kind of create a new level of competition in the marketplace that had an effect on, should we say, British-born working class people who relied on those jobs. So there's always been some tension with that, and UKIP and then Reform have been able to exploit that. So the problem is with groups like Reform, etc. I think they do everything's, there's a half truth in almost everything they talk about,
right?
But they're the wrong people, in my opinion, to deal with it, because they're then coming up with draconian methods that are going to be very unfair, and not ultimately going to be good for anybody other than them. And Nigel Farage himself, I mean, he is, in my opinion, such a horrible figure, and I find him a bit of a joke because he's a very wealthy man
personally,
who has, who's I think spends, he sort of portrays this. He's a former banker who likes to portray himself as a sort of man of the country and a man of the working class. So you often see him sort of dressed in kind of tweed clothing, which signifies the country connection, then holding up a pint of London Pride, which I guess for him signifies the working class connection. And you frequently see him...
It's performative and pandering.
Yeah, and you frequently see him in pubs around the country with this horrible grin, holding up one of these London Prides as if he's the man of the people. And a lot of people seem to fall for it, and I find it fascinating.
Well, so I have sort of two big questions around this, around these events, these outcomes. I mean, so Farage was certainly one of the loudest Pied Pipers for Brexit around,
Yes.
and a lot of the promises that were made in that campaign were not kept. The road after it was quite a bit bumpier than I think even supporters of it would have expected.
May I just say, both Farage and Boris Johnson just basically vanished after they got the vote, got the result they wanted, and took zero responsibility in anything.
To that point, Brexit apparently was supposed to stop Johnny Foreigner from coming in, the Slovenian plumber from taking all the jobs. Does that memory not linger in the mind of voters, or are they just on to, more immediate pressing economic concerns that are driving this?
Well, this is it. And I think, again, like with the rise of Trump and the second Trump term, I think people just forget, or it
Right.
becomes a cognitive dissonance where
Right.
people choose to
Right.
forget and choose not to acknowledge these things. And also, again, this sort of sense of sticking it to whoever's in charge, this idea, like Farage keeps banging on about the elites, etc. I mean, I think he is a member of the elite, always has been. I think he represents all that's wrong with the elite, to be honest with you, but he claims he's not. And so I think people just, for whatever reason, people who buy into him and his philosophy don't understand that and just choose to forget certain things, or they just don't keep track of politics the way. It's the other thing, actually. A lot of people don't keep track of politics. A lot of people don't even think about it
Right.
until there's an election.
Yeah, they just don't. Yeah.
And if your media diet is a combination of sort of right-wing YouTubers, the right-wing newspapers, then you're going to immediately think that Starmer's doing a bad job, and at the moment the Conservatives not much better. That'll be the perception you'll have. And then that will probably lead you, unfortunately, to going and looking at reform, or if you're very far left, you're going to look at the Green Party. Because also the other funny thing, that the Green Party are hardly brilliant. They're good on environmental policies, but their economic policies are far left of Jeremy Corbyn. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. So they get a lot of support sometimes when I really question if they actually got in a position of power, would they be a good idea? Probably not. So I think this is the big problem across the board, both in the US and the UK, is just generally people don't keep track of the facts on a national level. I think if their local councillor so this is the thing, like, UKIP politicians and councillors have hardly done well. Already there have been some people who've been removed from reform for various reasons. I think it's about 3 people who've been kicked out for various reasons. And I think these councillors, if they don't get some wins soon, then at least at the local level, people will see that actually the reform councillor wasn't much better than anybody else. And the big raw question for Nigel Farage is his constituency in Clacton-on-Sea, where he is currently an MP,
Right.
and doesn't like taking questions about
Right.
it. And there's a growing sense of, from my understanding, I could be wrong here, but from my understanding, from what I've read and seen, he's hardly doing a great job in Clacton-on-Sea.
Right.
So he may or may not lose that seat in the next general election. Who knows? But
the other sort of question that I have there, I mean, so for U.S. politics, kind of you can kind of, it kind of always goes generally this way, right? So following a presidential election, if a new party comes into the White House, the next year, the off year, there are some local races and then big governor's elections in Virginia and in New Jersey. And they're often taken as very early bellwethers, like a referendum on the president's party and his policies, right? Because social media and the decimation of local media, all sort of politics has become at least colored in a national way, right? And then the year following, we have the midterms in which, all of the House and a third of the Senate, I think, is up for re-election. This coming November, I fully expect, with all those fired federal workers in the DC suburbs, even if they aren't fired, all those federal workers in the DC suburbs, I expect it to be a total bloodbath for the Republicans there. And I was, to that point also, I was working in Democratic politics in 2009 and 2010 when Obama got his ass beat. And he easily went to, beat Romney and was, I think, generally kind of remembered now as a pretty good president. I think arguably could have won a 3rd term if he was able to run for it. I mean, he did fine. So it's not like if you suffer these losses early on in your tenure, it's not like you're doomed. So do you see that kind of being the case potentially for Labour here?
Well, to be honest with you, I think Labour had the shortest honeymoon period I've seen in recent politics. It's
turned very quickly. Very quickly.
It did. And so I've been of the opinion prior to this election that I think the next general election we might see a hung parliament is my prediction. And I still hold on to that. I don't think we're going to see an outright reform victory. Certainly not. And I don't think we're going to see an outright Labour victory either. I think reform will do damage to both Labour and Conservatives, probably more to the Conservatives than Labour on a numbers scale. But I think that will then be enough to stop Labour from getting a majority. And so then that will be very interesting, because then it's who can basically form a coalition effectively and fast enough to get things going. And so you could have a very bizarre combination of things that could play out. Logically, you would think Lib Dems and Labour, but we said that in 2015, in 2010, and look what happened. So yeah, I'm not sure at this time. Anything can happen. I mean, maybe, because like we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but like with the Canada and Australia, I mean, we could go into Canada and Australia if you want to. Actually, kind of logically makes sense. Yeah, they kind of, what we're seeing now, at least there, is a swing towards Liberal candidates. Right. But I think the difference is, at least for Canada, there's a perceived existential threat. I'm not sure what the situation is with Australia on that front. I don't think I've seen any threats to Australian sovereignty.
I think there's issues.
Time.
No. I think there's more. I mean, we'll save that for the next one.
Yeah. So, but whilst in the UK, we seem to, at the moment, we seem to be a bit more in line with US politics, and that kind of anti-establishment rhetoric that's driving a lot of things. And so, I just think we're in I don't think it's going to be easy for Labour. I don't think they should at all rest on their laurels if they think they're going to get the next election on the national level. They need to improve their messaging significantly. On top of that, there's still that kind of echoes of the Civil War in Labour from the kind of the centre and the far left.
Cromwell,
already.
Sorry? Cromwell, you're saying.
Cromwell?
The Civil War. Cromwell, the Civil War.
Oh. Not that Civil War, no. Sorry, I mean, as in the Corbyn era Civil War.
Oh, okay. I was thinking, wow, we're going way back there.
No.
Okay.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, you can't blame Oliver Cromwell for this necessarily, but no. So there was a sort of civil war within Labour when Jeremy Corbyn came in and eventually was left the leadership position. So the centre of Labour were quite anti-Corbyn, and then when Starmer and the centrists sort of took hold of Labour again, the far left were quite, noisy about Starmer and expressed a lot of vocal opposition, but then they calmed it down for the election. But now the results of this local election have come in. There are some MPs of the kind of Corbyn persuasion who have been bringing up certain statistics. I'll just see if I can just find one quickly on my phone that I saw a moment ago. Richard Bergen MP, who was definitely a Corbynite Labour MP. So he's put out on, I think it was Instagram, aping reform isn't the answer. Here are the top 5 reasons from a recent survey of why those who back Labour at the general election no longer do. So winter fuel allowance, number 1 at 35%. Then not reduce the cost of living at 33%. Then you got not improve public services, 26%. Broken promises, 25%. Not stood up to the rich and powerful, 23%. So really it's the winter fuel allowance and cost of living are the key issues, and then the other ones are more, they're still issues, but they're in play a bit there. Now, I don't think Labour can reduce the cost of living in 1 year. I don't think anybody could, unless Elon Musk decided to give every single individual £1 million, which could reduce the cost of living, and he would still be all right, I believe.
I think he's out of politics for a while.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
well, at least in that sort of like main character.
Well, yeah, because here's the other thing with reform. So I had a bit about US money. So obviously there's growing concerns about potential US funding for reform. And reports surfaced, I think it was last year, that Farage had held talks with Elon Musk about a possible donation. Then I think Musk then didn't feel Nigel Farage was the right man for the job. But then maybe these elections are showing promise, and that might change. Because one thing from a very broad perspective, Americans tend to like backing people who they think can actually win.
Yes.
They don't like to back losers.
Yes, that is true.
So if you look like a loser, you're going to lose American support very fast. And like that kind of played a little bit into World War II and like the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt and stuff. There were certain things that had to be achieved for America to say, okay, we're going to kind of quietly support you until Pearl Harbor happened. So Musk may or may not donate up to £100 million towards reform.
I mean, we certainly wouldn't want Russian money coming in and funding UK elections. Why are y'all
Yeah.
letting him do that?
Well, we are awaiting a public inquiry on that, but that's maybe later on. Basically, we might start seeing kind of, should we call it, foreign money start to influence things. And the thing is, I've always had a feeling that
That just seems like an utter disaster waiting to happen. Like, why would
Mm.
you? Why in the year of our Lord 2025? Should you not know better?
Yeah, well, yeah, but this is the thing. The people Farage appeals to, it's probably evangelical Christians, and it's people like Musk. It's these sort of libertarian tech bro guys who have a lot of money, and should we say not a lot of political sense of a liberal persuasion, should we put it that way, and end up backing all sorts of nutty candidates. So yeah, and then maybe they see there's an opportunity of influence down the line. If I don't think, I'm not of the opinion that Farage would be prime minister in the next election, next general election, but the one after, who knows?
How old is he?
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, he might. Well, I don't know. Will he age out? I mean, God, we've got Trump and everybody. 61 years old. He's got enough in him. So yeah, Nigel Farage is currently 61 years old.
He's got plenty of gas in the tank still.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Certainly, if he was running in America, he probably could until he's 80 something. I'm trying to think who the
Whippersnapper.
oldest prime minister we've ever
Whippersnapper,
had
yeah.
was, but yeah. So he'll either become a kingmaker in a coalition. I think that's what his next role could be. If there is this situation with a hung parliament and it becomes a bit like 2010, he could end up becoming deputy prime minister or something.
All right.
That's all possible. I think it's very unlikely that he would be prime minister in the next general election, but it's the one after. If Reform do manage to become the second party of UK politics, so it's Labour versus Reform, that could theoretically happen. I mean, it is going to be very difficult and very complicated. And there'll be a big civil war within the Conservative Party before that happens. So yeah, it's weird because I'd like to say it takes away, ultimately, the right wing fighting itself would take away votes from the right and move it to the left. But I'm just not seeing that motion happen in the UK at this time.
For just, again, from my perspective as an outsider looking in, I mean, number 10 frequently changes between Labour and the Tories. This is a natural order of things. And for me, it's not, I don't think it's really my place to have much of an opinion on it. The things that I do care about traditionally has stayed pretty much consistent, between them. However, in cases like Corbyn and now Farage, there's something about him and what I think he represents that worries me greatly.
Well, definitely. And you'll see, again, a little bit, you saw it with Corbyn too. I mean, I've always been fascinated of how Corbyn would have reacted to the war in Ukraine. And I actually think he would, again, have been very reluctant to physically help Ukraine. I could be wrong, but I suspect he would have been very reluctant to give any military aid. And he might even talk about NATO expansionism in Parliament and say Putin might have a point. I think that's where he would have gone. I could be wrong, but that's my suspicion.
Oh, yeah. I think just from what he said, I think there's no reason to expect anything else. Trident, gone.
Yeah, exactly. And with our horseshoe, Farage being on the right, is also equally pro-Putin and probably equally would have been very reluctant to support Ukraine, in that scenario. Obviously, who knows what's going to happen with Ukraine at the moment. But I think Farage, on a kind of geopolitical level, probably quite in step with Trump. So yeah, so we've said this before, we talk about the rise of Trumpism and people angry about it and talk about getting rid of the British-American alliance and stuff like that, and whether there's even gas in the tank for that. We said this before, the winds that brought Trump are blowing now in Britain, they're blowing across Europe, and they have been for some time. None of us are immune to this.
Yep.
And here's my pet theory on things at this time. Again, could be completely wrong here, but I think as the effects of climate change bring more catastrophe and, so for example, if we start having major fires or more pandemics, it's going to have a knock-on effect to our economies, which are already in a bad place. And you're going to see the general population who are basically wanting, the cost of living to come down, which is rising at this time and will get worse, I'm sure. And they're wanting to see people who can promise them what they want, and they will back anybody in time who will promise them what they want to hear. And the problem is, if you start bringing in far-right people, the far-right people like to close the door of democracy behind them, which then leaves the democratic, situation in a very difficult place once their time should have been finished. And this is an age-old problem. And this is the concern with the rise of Reform UK is, they're quite... they're quite populist and considered right wing almost. I would say they're the Diet Coke of the far right. They're not quite far right enough yet to be bad for you totally, but they're pretty damn bad if you have it too often.
Yeah, they're not AFD-ish, yeah.
That's the way I'd put it right now. They're not quite the BNP party, but they do have a lot of questionable people within them.
Yeah, if you turn the bottle over and look at the ingredients, there's a few carcinogens down there in very small text.
Yeah, and in my opinion, you do not want reform in any way, shape, or form in a place of authority. I think that would be a very bad idea. And so it really is up to Labour and the Conservatives to try and sort themselves out. I think so. Kemi Badenoch is the current leader of the Conservatives. I think her days were numbered from day one, in my opinion. I don't know whether we'll see a leadership challenge yet. They may or may not wait for the next local elections next year, but who knows? The Conservatives have been doing a lot of leadership changes over the last few years.
Yes, they have.
And the only consistency in British politics has been Larry the Cat at number 10. So it's like
Larry for PM.
And I'm not sure how old Larry is now. I think he might be. Let's have a look.
I think I saw somewhere they got a new cat that would sort of like, it's like, like the heir.
Larry 2.0. Yeah. Well, he's been there since 2007, apparently.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that right? Oh, no, hang on. He was born in 2007. He's been Mouser to the cabinet since 2011. So
okay.
Oh dear. So he's an old cat now. 18 years old. That's pretty old for a cat.
I would donate to the Larry for PM campaign.
Yeah, indeed. So I think ultimately, the rise of reform is a big concern for a lot of people, both on the right and the left. But I have a horrible feeling the Conservatives will try and become more like reform. So they'll be the Coke Zero of reform. If you want to put it that way. And then, it'll be, I guess, the next general election or beyond will determine whether voters like the Coke Zero of conservative stroke reform politics or not. And if they don't, then, reform might end up like UKIP. UKIP has, I think, died a death now and sort of turned into reform. But these movements have come and gone. And I'm hoping that the British public will send them packing. But I'm not 100% convinced that that's the case right now. It's not going to be easy. So
we'll see.
That's kind of feeling there at the moment, I think.
Yep. Indeed.
Well, everybody, let's take a break and we'll be right back with more. Welcome back, everybody. So our next story is about the Australian elections and the Canadian elections, which is one you picked out, Matt. And I think it kind of goes in quite nicely to what we've just been talking about. So I'll hand it over to you.
So a pair of major elections over the past 2 weeks in Canada and Australia have delivered results that reflect a growing political undercurrent across Western democracies. When candidates are seen as aligning too closely with Donald Trump or his style of politics, voters increasingly pull away. In Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney replaced Justin Trudeau and led the Liberal Party to winning a fourth term in office, despite his party entering the year trailing by as much as 25 points in the polls. His opponent, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, was viewed by many as echoing aspects of Trump's tone and approach. In the final stretch, Carney's steadier image, institutional experience — he was a former president of the head of the Bank of England, I believe.
That's correct, yeah.
Appeared to resonate more with voters looking for predictability and a prime minister eager to push back against Trump's bullying. Then in Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese expanded his majority and was returned to power, while opposition leader Peter Dutton, who had leaned into rhetoric and policies reminiscent of Trump at certain points in the campaign, struggled to make his case. Dutton emphasized his party's prior success negotiating with Trump and argued that he could do the same, but it wasn't a pitch that moved the electorate. In both races, foreign policy unusually took center stage. A key question for voters became who is best equipped to manage relations with the second Trump administration. And in both cases, a majority of voters backed candidates they felt would strike a firm but measured posture, capable of engaging Washington without appearing too eager to align with Trump's worldview. These elections don't necessarily say much about domestic political preferences beyond their borders, but taken together, they do show something more important. In English-speaking democracies beyond the U.S., even the slightest association with Donald Trump isn't playing as an electoral advantage. If anything, it appears to be a liability. Chris, what do you think about these two?
Well, with the Canadian elections, definitely the Liberals have benefited from Trump's Canada 51st state rhetoric.
Oh, yeah.
Because the Liberals were very unpopular and they were pretty much considered to be going to lose the next election. And then suddenly Canadian nationalism and Canadian pride sort of took over because Trump was threatening Canada quite directly. And Mark Carney, being the Liberal, was so diametrically opposed to Trump that he benefited from being diametrically opposed to Trump, and won the election pretty well. Now, Carney, one thing I would say about Carney, he's a very competent man, and I think what's refreshing a little bit is to see at least the success of a competent politician, because there's the one thing I felt for a while, that we seem to live in an age of incompetence a lot of the time. I think Starmer, for me, I think is competent. I don't think he's necessarily a great communicator or necessarily an inspiring figure in the slightest, but he has a certain level of competency, even though some people might disagree there. But Mark Carney definitely strikes me as a competent man. He was the head of the Bank of England. And I know with Canadian friends of mine, generally, a Canadian friend of mine way before the turn towards anti-Trumpism took hold in Canada, was saying to me he hoped Carney would win the election. So he, great for Canada, really. So what might happen now? I think Carney will have a good honeymoon period because of the Trump stuff. And even with his meeting with Trump in the Oval Office, Trump again was bringing up this nonsense about Canada being the 51st state.
That was yesterday as we're recording.
Yeah, that was embarrassing to watch. And it was, and like watching the journalists in the room kind of sort of laughing with Trump, but it was a very fake, nervous sounding laugh.
The White House press corps has been so just lobotomized and broken and just racked with Stockholm syndrome. It's astounding at times.
I know, so that's a whole other topic I think in itself.
Yes.
This whole 51st state thing's really bad, but we'll talk about that in a minute, maybe some more. With regards to Australia, so a listener to our podcast, Tom from Australia, actually reached out to me with a question with regards to Rupert Murdoch parroting, Rupert Murdoch's media parroting Kremlin talking points. But he shared a really interesting article that is bang on with what we're discussing today. So thank you, Tom. So there's a really good piece in The Guardian that he shared with me about the declining power and influence of Rupert Murdoch's News Corps in Australia and how that may have affected the election results. Tom did bring up an interesting point about, with regards to the parroting of Kremlin talking points, because we know Fox News in the US, which has been very powerful for a long time, I think it may or may not be on its downward spin now, but many cite Fox News as being partially responsible for swaying Republicans in America towards the populist MAGA movement. So there has been a lot of power of Rupert Murdoch. So the article points out that there are many reasons for News Corps' sort of declining power in Australia, but mostly it's part of a wider story of mainstream media and its waning influence, which in America Trump benefited from, but in Australia it seems to be the Liberals are benefiting from. And so there's no longer any single media outlet that reaches deep into all the democrats in Australia to win power. So, once television news served that purpose, but now it no longer does. So it may be the flip side of the American situation where, when we look after the fact that people who influenced Australian voters, maybe, I don't know whether, I haven't watched a lot of Australian YouTubers, etc., whether they're less Joe Rogan and more liberal, I don't know. Can't speak for that. But please, Australian listeners, do reach out more with regards to this, because it's a very interesting thing. But it is, again, like we were saying earlier, Britain's swinging to the right at the moment, whilst Canada and Australia are swinging to the left. And I think, at least for Canada, it's because of the existential threat to Canadian sovereignty right now, or the perceived threat, because whether it's a genuine threat or not, is open to debate. I think I am concerned with regards to Trump keeps going on about it, because I think with Trump surrounding himself with yes men, that puts us in a more dangerous place. But whether you'll see a full out attack on Canada in the next few years, I think that's highly unlikely, and I hope it stays that way. I
can speak to that in a minute, but yeah.
Yeah. But what are your thoughts on this, man?
Well, I mean, just starting with Australia, I think sort of, the issues that with them, and I know there are quite a few Australian listeners, so please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of the issues that concern them vis-a-vis Trump are issues, of course, around the trade wars, defense spending as it relates to China, AUKUS as well, and concerns that issues here with our shipbuilding capacity here in the U.S. could force some alterations of the terms of those of that deal, which all well and good. In addition, over the last few years, the DoD has put a lot of money in expanding certain Australian air bases and ports and stuff to accommodate like U.S. long range strategic bombers and stuff. There's a rotational Marine garrison up near Darwin. So there's been deepening ties between the U.S. And Australia over the last few years, and I certainly think looking at China in the future, I think that's absolutely critical. It is interesting also to hear about the perhaps lessening impact of Murdoch's papers and press in the country. I didn't know that, but old Rupert is certainly going to be gone sooner rather than later. He's well up into his 90s, and I'm also interested to see, how that affects kind of the reach and tenor of his empire across, not just Australia. After he's gone, HBO recently finished a very good series about this exact same scenario. So we'll leave that there. Go check that one out if you haven't. But as far as Canada, so Mark Carney met with Trump in the Oval yesterday as we're recording this. I think conducted himself brilliantly. I think there were a lot of concerns that it would have just evolved into like a shit show, frankly, that the Zelensky meeting was. Trump did bring up it came up, the 51st state thing, of course, and Carney made it very clear, Canada is not for sale and will never be for sale. And Trump, because he's first and foremost a petulant, immature asshole, goes, "Oh, we'll never say never." And I think that's what the
painful.
It's totally just embarrassing and just disgraceful, and of course even more disgraceful that the White House press corps, some of them would laugh at that, but here we are, and I think just again, as Carney conducted himself brilliantly, just reiterated never, like said it a few times. As far as the 51st state thing, so it's serious in terms of how hurtful and bullying and immature, and just it does not serve the American people in any way, shape, or form that is positive at all. But beyond that, I don't think it's operationally serious in terms of like a military threat. It's just not. My read on this, how it started, it seems like a very kind of immature dig at Trudeau. That people around him just got very too committed to the bit. And it's sort of, like a running thing now to them. I also think in a sense, him talking about it, Trump talking about it has lessened a lot over the past few months. You don't hear it that much. certainly since Carney became prime minister. But I think it certainly was a negotiating tactic on the trade deals and everything. And, I know when a lot of people hear that, oh, it's a negotiating tactic, you're like, no, that's not a negotiating tactic. I would offer this analogy, if someone threatens to harm themselves whenever their partner suggests that they want to leave the relationship. I mean, yes, it is psychological abuse, it is emotional abuse, it is deeply wrong and evil, frankly. But to that person, it is a negotiating tactic. I kind of see it that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's assuming that Trump has all his mental capacities, etc., and that just this isn't the babbling of a madman or a man going mad, which is my feeling a little bit on it.
I think there is a part of his brain that is so high on his own supply and drunk on power and, sundowning potentially and just sort of in his own world, consumed with all this kind of flattery around him that he does sort of think, yeah, why can't we just make a really sweet deal and we'll just, absorb Canada. Yeah, why not? And there's no one around him to say, Mr. President, that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. Shut the hell up. Never say that to anyone else outside of this room. What is wrong with you? Which in the first term there were. But that said, it being operationalized beyond that, no, I truly don't. I mean, that's not to say that Canadians should just sort of suck it up and take it, and not take it personally. I'm not suggesting that at all, but I would not fear U.S. tanks coming across your southern border anytime.
No, but it definitely is damaging to the partnerships and stuff. And this has been, again, I've been saying this for weeks now, that all Trump has done since getting into office is his priority is to piss off every ally,
right,
weaken every alliance, and ultimately China and Russia benefit from that.
Well,
and,
to that point also, as I was saying, I think Carney really conducted himself brilliantly and struck the right tone in how you deal with Trump. So my unsolicited advice, not that I think any of them are listening right now, for foreign leaders, navigating Trump, foreign governments, I think you should, as Carney did yesterday, be firm, stand up for yourself, push back when and where you need to, ignore him when and where you can, but I would say don't forget that there are folks in the administration like Vance who, for reasons I'm not entirely certain, seem hell-bent on detonating every alliance that we have. And, in the grand scope of geopolitics and international relations, unfortunately, 4 years is both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. And, before anyone listening goes, oh, well, what if he, no, don't you do that. He gets 4 years and then his ass is out on the curb for good this time. And I think to even entertain pulling that off, he needs to be popular, the economy needs to be very strong, and he needs to control Congress. Right now, 100 days in, the trend lines on those are all pointing unambiguously turning against him. And I don't see how he turns that back. So who follows him is up to us as Americans to redeem ourselves. But I would just suggest that be kept in mind in the meantime.
Yeah. Well, let's take another break and we'll be right back with more. Well, welcome back, everybody. So, Matt, our final story is one you picked out about Mike Waltz, and I'll let you talk to us about that.
Yeah, we're drawing in here from a collection of articles from The Atlantic and The Washington Post by a number of really great journalists. So this is something that broke the minute we were sitting down to record the last episode.
Yes.
So we're finally getting around to it now. And we know we kind of know what's going on now, as we didn't before. But anyway, so here we go. The ouster of National Security Advisor Mike Waltz marked the first major shakeup of Trump's second term, and while Signalgate was clearly a tipping point for Waltz's short tenure after he accidentally added the Atlantic's editor to a Signal chat discussing military strikes in Yemen, it was far from the whole story. According to reporting from The Atlantic and The Washington Post, Waltz's position had been weakening for months, and what ultimately sealed his fate wasn't a messaging misfire, but foreign policy freelancing. In the lead up to a February Oval Office meeting, Waltz engaged in what officials described as intense coordination with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, backing Israeli proposals for a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities without Trump's knowledge or approval. The president, who has remained skeptical of new military entanglements and is focused on striking deals with both Moscow and Tehran, was reportedly furious. For Trump's inner circle, Waltz, a Cheney-era hawk who once appeared in a 2016 anti-Trump ad calling him a Vietnam draft dodger, my, how far we've come, was always a tenuous fit. Despite trying to prove his loyalty with TV hits and a hard purge of Biden-era NSC staff, he never made it into Trump's inner circle. By late April, a meeting with far-right activist Laura Loomer in the Oval Office, where she accused members of Waltz's team of disloyalty, only deepened his isolation. Waltz was removed last week, just after the 100-day mark of the administration. He's now been nominated to serve as ambassador to the United Nations, and in the interim, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is pulling double duty as both chief diplomat and national security advisor. It's the first time these roles have been combined since Henry Kissinger held them from 1973 to 1975. But more than a personnel swap, the shakeup signals a deeper shift, an increasingly loyalty-first White House with a shrinking role for traditional national security structures, and a president who now believes he doesn't need an NSC, just people who follow his lead. Chris, what'd you think?
Well, poor old Marco Rubio.
I know.
I hope he's either
know.
got a very good plan of keeping himself organized or drinks a shit ton of coffee. And doesn't have to
Work-life balance.
Yeah, and doesn't have to kind of resort to slightly illegal uppers. So we won't go into that. I'm not saying he is, but I hope he doesn't have to. So yeah, there's so many different things, this Waltz thing. So I'll just cover kind of bits that stood out to me from the articles that I read. So one of the first points was apparently he didn't work well with other senior members of Trump's team, they said, and couldn't prove to the president that he was able to manage his own staff. That was quite an interesting thing. Waltz is very much in the support Ukraine and military aid camp. His first reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to accuse President Putin of war crimes. And he was reportedly always pushing for sanctions against Russia if they did not cooperate with the peace talks. And obviously they haven't, and Team Trump so far have done very little about that at this time. And I think that, it's his stance on military aid to Ukraine would have definitely have put him at odds with Hegseth and probably President Trump himself. Waltz is viewed traditionally as a sort of hawkish character on China and Iran, which in some respects is more in line with the kind of Cheney-Bush era than the Trump isolationist era. The Washington Post piece that you also drew from talks about how Waltz was an advocate for military force against Iran and that he may have negotiated behind Trump's back with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it looks like Waltz may have been coordinating Netanyahu to persuade Trump to basically back some sort of military action against Iran. Now, on many levels, this is wrong of Waltz to do that. You don't push an agenda with a foreign leader and then use them to persuade the president. I think that's a very bad thing to do from a precedent point of view. I don't think that's good at all. So I can, on that level, at least understand why Trump wants to get rid of Waltz. And also, with the whole Signalgate thing as well, I think Waltz has not come across at all well. But it's also interesting to note that his dismissal has reportedly elevated the anxiety of key US allies who saw him as a stabilizing force in the administration because of his pro-NATO views and support for Ukraine. Which he had also voiced as a member of Congress. And, as reported, Waltz, despite aligning his views of America First, was never fully trusted and didn't make it into Trump's inner circle. So those are kind of things that really stood out for me. So when he did get he got demoted rather than fired because he's now going to be the ambassador for the UN or something.
He's nominated, yeah. I can talk more about that in a second, but yeah.
And is that because he could name different countries and all the Signal group chats that he set up that made him perfect for that role?
He has one, yeah. Yeah, he has one for every country. Different, 100 and almost 200 Signal group chats in his phone.
Yeah, pretty impressive that. So
it is.
So then it names like there's a subgroup, each one for the capitals and other key cities. I could back that. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on the Waltz drama?
To your point there. So there's a really good quote in the Washington Post piece here. I'll just read it. So it says, if Jim Baker was doing a side deal with the Saudis to subvert George H.W. Bush, you'd be fired, a Trump advisor said, referring to Bush's Secretary of State. You can't do that. You work for the president of your country, not a president of another country. And I'm as I read this, I'm sitting there thinking, like, not me agreeing with an anonymous Trump advisor in the Washington Post, but here we are. Yeah, you can't do that under any circumstance, under any administration. And I think it also, in a way, speaks to the continued arrogance of Bibi Netanyahu, no matter who's in the White House. Like, know your place, sir. But as far as the nomination to being UN ambassador, it's certainly a golden parachute for him. If he does get confirmed, he gets to get the hell out of Washington. Gets a really nice, swanky penthouse with great views of the East River and Midtown Manhattan. So not a bad place to hang out for the next couple years. I'm gonna. My analysis, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that there's a small chance that he runs into some serious trouble in his confirmation. I don't know if the trouble will be severe enough to pick off 3 Republican senators. So it would be like Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and let's say someone like Tom Tillis of where's he from? North Carolina. And that's, of course, that math factors that there are no Democratic defections from, say, like Pennsylvania's John Fetterman, who's been a bit of a wild card for his own reasons in the last few months. But he in his confirmation hearing before the Senate, Foreign Relations Committee, he's going to get bombarded with questions about Signalgate and his handling of that, and just his judgment, how that speaks to his judgment. And I think how he performs in that hearing is really critical, not just for how Trump sees him, because Trump really does not like his people to go out and shit the bed on national television, but also just how if there does end up being enough Republican defections to sink his nomination, you would need 3, and of course no Democrats to vote for him. It would happen because that confirmation hearing is just a disaster. I don't know. I think he's still odds are pretty good he'll get through. There are far more odious members of Trump's orbit who could be picked for that job, certainly, but we'll see. As far as the role of the National Security Council and everything, I can speak to that a bit more if you'd like me to for listeners.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Part of the story was how the staff of the National Security Council has been sort of gutted in recent months. Laura Loomer came in and demanded a few of those staffers be fired and everything, and Trump now sort of sees it. Like, why does he need this sort of policy apparatus advising him when his brain has all the best ideas anyway? So the National Security Council staff, which is housed in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, it's just across a little side street parking lot from the West Wing in the White House complex. So that staff is the president's in-house foreign policy team. It's not a cabinet agency like state or defense. It exists entirely to serve the president's agenda, coordinate the national security process, and make sure that when crises hit, the U.S. government isn't tripping over itself. A typical NSC staff fluctuates quite a bit. In decades past, if we go into Reagan, Bush Sr. and stuff, it was only like a few dozen people. Under Obama and Biden, I think that staffing creeped up to approaching 350, 400 a bit. And I think there were legitimate criticisms of how the size of the NSC has just sort of ballooned under those presidents. I think that's a fair debate to have. I don't really feel strongly about it either way, but usually recently it hovers around 200 to 300 people, all career experts detailed from across the interagency, so state, defense, CIA, et cetera, plus some political appointees. So let's say a senior director for the Middle East, right? That would be some sort of policy wonk that's kind of known in whatever circles the president's party is, and they get hired for that job or something. Traditionally, is kind of the person that goes to. It's organized by regional and functional directorates, like say like Europe, Middle East, cyber, counterterrorism, and so on. And these people don't run operations, an exception for Oliver North, and he got in trouble for that. They run the policy process. So they chair interagency meetings, they prep decision memos, vet options, and make sure the president hears all sides before choosing a path. So I mean, think of them as sort of like the policy choreographers, like the glue between departments that otherwise, it's like herding. It's a bit like herding cats. So when the NSC staff works, you get coherent foreign policy. When it doesn't, you get conflicting press statements, rogue actors freelancing, kind of like Waltz did, and the kind of chaos that makes allies nervous and adversaries bold. So I mean, the Trump administration's first term offered a few examples, like when top officials couldn't explain a clear rationale for why the U.S. killed Iran's Qasem Soleimani when it did, because there had been no interagency process beforehand to kind of come to this conclusion. And also, COVID showed what happens when you disband NSC offices like the Global Health, Security, and Biodefense Directorate and lose the ability to coordinate fast in a crisis. So the NSC's power isn't in issuing orders, it's in proximity. Being in the White House gives its staff power to convene pressure and align the system to how to get what the president needs to get done. I think gutting the NSC staff will make it a lot harder that Trump is able to follow through on doing with some of the more batshit stuff like Greenland, let's say, but maybe we'll save that for next week. When they're sidelined or gutted, that power, disappears. And this is why Waltz's departure kind of, matters. He didn't just fall out of favor. He left behind an NSC that was already bleeding out on the floor. The precedent there with Kissinger, though, who was, he did double duty as Secretary of State also from 73 to 75. And in that time period, Nixon was upstairs, talking to ghosts at the bottom of a whiskey bottle during the worst of Watergate. And there are some crises like the Yom Kippur War. There was a whole kind of exchange of fire between, I think, Khmer Rouge forces who had captured an American patrol boat, and they were trying to take him back to the Cambodian mainland. And there was a whole crisis, like how do we like what action should we take? Nixon was checked out for all of that. And Kissinger on his own, because he had such clout and power as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, really ran the foreign policy of he was like the foreign policy president during that time period. And of course, the public didn't really know that at the time. And say what you will about how Kissinger exercised that policy into Laos and everything like that. I will say that I think now especially it is, those two jobs are way too big for any one person to hold them at the same time. And I'll say again, whatever you think of Henry Kissinger, I'm certainly not a fan of a lot of stuff that he did. Marco Rubio, sir, you are no Henry Kissinger. So we'll see how long that holds together.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well, really, at this time. If it's a big crisis, which, I mean, the world at the moment...
Well, there was yesterday.
Yeah, the world is kind of currently on fire, isn't it? So, I think we're only a few more wars away from a full-blown everybody at war, aren't we, really? So it's, the whole India-Pakistan thing that we touched upon last week's really flared up. Obviously, ongoing problem of Ukraine at this time. So but I'm missing out quite a few things there, but there's a lot of conflict going on in the world right now, and that's not getting any easier, and it requires some really good diplomatic and national security kind of coordination that is sort of slowly being diminished by the Trump administration. And I know, I was reading, I think it was in the Washington Post, that American allies are concerned about that Trump is using loyalty tests, etc., with people in key positions, and people, senior partners might start being in a situation of trying to please Trump more than anything else, and that's quite dangerous because it might affect the flow of information towards allies. They might start getting tainted truth and stuff like that. So it's yeah, very difficult times ahead, really, and best for us to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. So yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add, or are you happy with what?
No, that's my read, that's my analysis, that's my sort of background on it. We'll see. Very curious to see how Waltz handles that confirmation hearing. And I think I said that on Blue Sky as soon as it was announced he was being nominated. Get your popcorn for that hearing because it's going to be wild.
It will be, and I suppose. Does Trump not really care what happens after? It's now out of his hands. It's sort of natural selection at this point.
Good question. I mean, he doesn't really have the luxury of being able to pull anyone out of Congress to put in that job. He doesn't need to put someone from Congress in that job. I am surprised, though, that if he was freelancing behind Trump's back with Bibi on striking Iranian nuclear facilities, that he didn't just kick Waltz to the curb. I mean, the UN ambassador is a very cushy landing spot for him. That surprised me.
Is there a concern maybe on Trump's part of it might be seen as a slight towards Netanyahu if he did that? I don't know.
Or that Waltz would go the John Bolton route if he just sort of, kicked him out like a dog.
Well, yeah, is Trump
maybe
Trump doing a bit of image management and trying to keep learning lessons from his past, and or somebody in his staff is learning lessons from the past to keep people sweet.
I think Trump sort of stopped learning lessons at some point in the 80s.
Yeah. But maybe some people around him have learned them because they do seem a bit more. This Trump 2.0 does seem a little bit more competent and savvy than Trump 1.0. But
I don't agree with that at all. I think they're still. I think that was they talked up that game a lot that they would be when they came into power. But I think in many regards, I mean, they're a lot more assured. They're a lot more kind of like a Terminator mode, kind of focused on like crush the opposition, do not give them an inch, move forward ceaselessly, and do not give them time to regroup and stop you. But as this goes on, and I think certainly as the economy sort of starts to get worse going ahead, there's still a lot of the same kind of infighting and just chaos and dysfunction, and they just don't know things. So many of them. So, I mean, yeah, they're still, in many ways, a lot of them are still exactly how they were. They're just more, their Dunning-Kruger effect is more exacerbated this time.
Yeah, they got a lot more confidence. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, time will tell how this will play out. And I was really intrigued, obviously, with the whole Netanyahu and his plans of Iran. I don't know if there's anything you want to speak to that at all at this time. Or
he's wanted to do that for 20 years. And this is, I mean, objectively, yeah, this is his best opportunity to do so, and it must hurt him quite a bit that his friend doesn't want to join him on that adventure. But we'll see on that.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think that's it for today. But we did want to just quickly say thank you very much. We did get some really nice reviews last week, and we appreciate that, and thank you for supporting us in that way.
Very, very grateful to see those. Yeah, we sort of asked for it a bit. I think some of the reviews we'll get. I think it's people who, I mean. Chris, because I talk to you about this offline sometimes. I mean, I am certainly sensitive to the idea of like bias and being like how we're seen and stuff. And like not that I want to do the podcast by like committee or I feel like I need to try to like that we need to like please all viewpoints. I definitely don't think that. But I mean, I've done such anal stuff as like feeding, dozens of transcripts and like into, and like generating kind of like metrics and stuff. And like, how do we tend to sound like over time generally, I've looked into stuff like that because it's just an interest of mine. But I think, I often we talk about things like the titles and stuff will be stuff that appeal to certain probably Trumpy, I'll say, I won't necessarily conservative, I'll say Trumpy minded people who then come and listen to it, and it's, not what they hear on Fox News or like some, bro podcast or something, and they, react like a knee jerk, like, you don't like Trump, 1 star, and leave. But I mean, I think generally those people, I don't pay a lot of attention to it because I think, if I saw a review that was like, hey, I've been listening to this for a couple years and it's really fallen off, or like the tone has changed in a way that I just don't really, feel comfortable with anymore, that my ears up would perk up immediately, and I definitely see need for a course correction somewhere. But to that point, it's nice to when people sort of come in and say nice stuff. I will say though, the smoke that I bring to this mic for Trump, I do not bring for Mitt Romney or John McCain or even George Bush. It is kind of particularly for him and what he represents and what he has wrought upon this country and the world that I don't like. I mean, I said this on Blue Sky over the weekend. I was sort of plugging us a bit. I said, as long as you're on Team Democracy, I think you absolutely can feel at home with us.
Yeah.
So whether
Yeah.
you're traditionally were a Republican or are a Republican that just aren't happy with how things are right now, that's all cool. And frankly, I think at least in principle, Ronald Reagan would probably agree with like 75% of what we talk about.
Yeah.
If in principle,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I like to think we're honest with our views,
Yes.
because I don't hide my disdain for Trump and Trumpism and MAGA, and I think there are very valid reasons to be upset with Trumpism, MAGA, etc. And and I've done many episodes with very interesting people about how he's inflamed the far right and exaggerated problems, etc. And I think it's like that idea of sort of truth to power. We have to be honest and call it how we see it. And obviously, we sit in an interesting place in the kind of national security / espionage podcast sphere, if you want to call it that, because there's quite a few shows that are similar to us that don't go where we go. We probably lean a bit more heavy on the geopolitics these days. And then partly that is probably because espionage is ultimately about geopolitics, and it's a fascinating thing,
That drives me nuts sometimes when you'll hear like, readers in the thriller genre that'll say, oh, I liked it till they put the politics in or whatever. Like, what do you think all this is? It's in service of nation states doing politics. Like, what do you think this is for? And of course, if you're going to, if there's a shootout or something and your character stops and they, have this treatise on like, I don't know, civil rights or whatever. Yeah, that's out of place and that's weird. But like this is politics. It's interesting.
Indeed. And I think when I've looked broadly at most of the 1-star reviews, I think a lot of them are just mean-spirited and just generally people who are obviously of the pro-Trump persuasion who are offended by something.
I think they're just not used to hearing it.
Yeah. And I keep an eye. There are 1 or 2 reviews that bring up something specific, like there's been they had a perceived problem with sound. Or I don't know, they don't like the way we angled something, etc. I think there are some people who hear what they want to hear and totally misconstrued things. There's been 1 or 2 reviews where I'm like, we didn't actually say that. So yeah, and we're not alone. And I know like the Rest Is Politics had a bit of that, and other shows too.
Yeah, and they get it. Yeah, way worse too. Yeah,
it comes with the territory. It's the unfortunate side of putting things out in the public domain is obviously not everybody's going to like what you do, and that's fair enough. My view is, as long as the people who do enjoy this and we're serving them, that's important. And obviously we have a nice relationship with people where people do let us know if there's something they're not quite happy with, and we do yearly surveys now just to make sure, get a barometer check to make sure we're not, what's the word, high on our own supply. I hope we're never high on our own supply. But it's always nice to get a positive review. It gives us a bit of a spring in our step, and especially when you read it and you're like, actually, yeah, they really got the show and what we're trying to do, etc. And that feels like we've done a good job. So thank you.
Well, I'll say this bit last. I will never lie to you, dear I will never knowingly lie to you, dear reader. I'll gonna tell you what I think and why, and it'll never be in doubt what my values are.
Yeah, it's same with me, and it's like, yeah, I just don't. There's this sort of people go on about biased. I think the people who talk about it the most tend to be the most biased because they don't critically examine their own sort of media diets. I would make a prediction a lot of them are listening to, Joe Rogan, etc., and have no problem with half the stuff he puts out. But
Right. I mean, it's also like if this is going to be a bit, frank and crude perhaps, but like if unbiased does not mean that you need equal airing of all views.
Yeah.
Just because you ate and enjoyed like a really good cheeseburger and fries doesn't mean that you now also, if you want to be unbiased, you have to go chow down on this hunk of dog shit.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
No. If anything, you've got to just sort of challenge the lie, really, and challenge the nonsense. And we said before at the beginning, we'll call it as we see it. I think Trump is a very negative force, but there are one or two things where there may be, there may be a grain of truth in what he's saying somewhere, or there's a policy that maybe he did get right. It's just very hard when there are very few of them to really champion it.
We haven't focused much on Iran recently, and we will coming up soon. I intend, but that's an area where honestly I have very, very little complaints right now about how that's going. It could change. We'll see. I don't trust him at all, as I don't trust a toddler running around the house with a knife at night. But
yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. So, again, thank you very much for those reviews. Thank you very much for everybody who does enjoy this podcast and, is listening to it and engages with us. Thank you so much. Your support means the world to us and it keeps us going. And what's nice to see is obviously our numbers have grown in the last year. They've grown up quite a lot, which is fantastic. So I feel like we're definitely doing something right. So we just hope we keep doing the right thing and with the right philosophy kind of going forward. We don't knowingly or intentionally go out to offend people or be controversial for the sake of controversy, etc.
If you think this is me being intentionally offensive, you have no idea.
Well, yeah, this is it. And I don't have there was one review who said I had a thinly veiled contempt for Trump. I don't think it's thinly veiled, but
no. I go out in the front yard and wave that thing around for everyone to see. There was no veil there.
Oh man. So anyway. Well, we will be doing listener questions at the end of this month again. So do drop us an email at secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about. If you have a link that's relevant you'd like us to see, please share that. And importantly, please let us know how you'd like to be credited on air, because I don't want to just read out your name blind and then suddenly, I don't know, give away that you live in a particular place and etc. So let us know how you'd like to be credited on air. And thank you again to past listeners who've done that, and we look forward to future questions coming forward. So yeah, Matt, thank you for your time today, and
thank you.
It's been I think a good episode, and we will catch you all next week. Thank you very much.
See ya.
Take care. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.